The fluorescent lights of the megamart hummed with a low, rhythmic buzz that usually helped me drown out the crushing silence of the graveyard shift. My name is Elias, and for 3 years, I have been the sole security guard for this 4-acre concrete labyrinth of consumer goods. At 3 in the morning, the building feels less like a store and more like a massive, rib-caged beast that swallowed me whole. I was sitting in the small, cramped security booth near the loading docks, staring at 16 flickering monitors, when the first call came through the internal landline. It was the phone located at the deli counter, nearly 300 yards away on the opposite side of the building. I picked up the receiver, expecting a prank from the night stalking crew, but all I heard was the heavy, rhythmic sound of someone breathing directly into the mouthpiece. I stared at the monitor covering the deli section, but the area was bathed in shadows and the grainy black and white feed showed no one standing by the counter. "Very funny, Marcus," I said into the phone, assuming it was one of the guys from the warehouse playing a trick to break the boredom. There was no reply, only that steady, wet intake of air that seemed to vibrate against my own ear through the plastic handset. I hung up the phone and wiped my palm against my trousers, feeling a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the industrial air conditioning. 5 seconds later, the phone in the garden center began to ring, its shrill, old-fashioned bell echoing through the empty aisles like a scream. I checked the monitor for the garden center, and again the space was completely empty, yet the light on my console indicated that the receiver had been lifted. The silence on the other end of the second call was even heavier than the first, a suffocating void that made my heart hammer against my ribs. I realized then that whoever was doing this wasn't just standing in one place. They were moving through the store with a speed that didn't seem physically possible. How could they get from the deli to the garden center in seconds without appearing on a single one of my cameras? I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and my radio, stepping out of the glass booth and into the vast, dark expanse of the main floor. The aisles felt longer than usual, the towering shelves of cereal boxes and laundry detergent creating deep, jagged shadows that seemed to shift whenever I turned my head. I began to walk toward the center of the store, my boots clicking loudly on the polished linoleum, making me feel incredibly exposed. Suddenly, the overhead intercom system crackled to life with a burst of static that made me jump nearly a foot off the ground. I expected to hear a voice, a demand, or even a threat, but instead, the speakers broadcasted the sound of my own footsteps. I froze in place, and the sound through the speakers stopped instantly, leaving me standing in a terrifyingly quiet vacuum. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Someone was following me, holding a portable store phone open and broadcasting my own movements back to me. I spun around, shining my light down the long corridor of aisle 12, but the beam only hit the shiny surfaces of canned soup and plastic wrap. Where could they be hiding in a place so wide and open, and how did they know exactly where I was stepping? I decided to head for the main electrical room to lock myself in and call the police from a secure line. As I hurried past the electronics department, every single display television suddenly flickered to life, showing nothing but gray static and snow. The light from the screens cast a ghostly, blue glow over the area, and then the phone at the nearby tech desk began to ring. I didn't want to answer it, but I felt a strange, magnetic pull of curiosity and dread that forced my hand toward the receiver. When I pressed it to my ear, I didn't hear breathing this time. I heard the sound of a zipper being slowly undone, very close to a microphone. The sound was so intimate and so predatory that I dropped the phone and began to run toward the back of the store. I reached the heavy steel door of the electrical room, but as I reached for my keys, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. The door was already slightly ajar, and a single muddy footprint was smeared across the threshold, pointing inward. Someone was already inside the one place I thought was safe, waiting for me in the dark among the high-voltage transformers. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in jagged gasps, and headed instead for the warehouse stairs that led to the narrow catwalks above the floor. I climbed the metal rungs as fast as I could, my hands trembling so hard I nearly lost my grip on the cold iron railing. From the elevated catwalk, I could see almost the entire floor, and I scanned the darkness for any sign of a moving figure. That was when I saw it. A small, red light blinking near the top of a shelf in the toy department, right where I had been standing moments before. It was a baby monitor, taped to the side of a shelf, its camera lens pointed directly at the path I had just taken. I looked further down the aisle and saw another one, and then another, a trail of electronic eyes that had been tracking my every move since I left the booth. The silent caller wasn't a ghost. He was a hunter who had rigged the entire store into a personal surveillance trap. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a private number flashing on the screen, and I made the mistake of answering it one last time. "I see you up there, Elias," a voice whispered, sounding like sandpaper rubbing against wood. "And there is nowhere to go but down." I looked toward the far end of the catwalk and saw a tall, thin silhouette step out from behind a stack of crates, holding a long, serrated utility knife. He began to walk toward me, his movements slow and deliberate, knowing that I was trapped on a narrow bridge 30 feet above the concrete floor. I looked down at the shelving units below me and realized my only chance was to jump onto a large pallet of oversized plush pillows in the bedding department. It was a terrifying drop, but it was better than facing the man with the knife who was now only 20 feet away. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and leaped into the darkness, feeling the rush of air before crashing into the soft, yielding mountain of fabric. The impact knocked the wind out of me, but I didn't wait to recover. I scrambled to my feet and sprinted toward the emergency exit near the loading docks. I pushed the crash bar with all my weight, and the alarm began to blare, a deafening, beautiful noise that signaled the end of the silence. I burst out into the cool night air, running across the parking lot until I reached the main road where I flagged down a passing patrol car. The police searched the Megamart for hours, but they found no one inside, only the trail of baby monitors and a burner phone left sitting on the catwalk. To this day, I never answer a phone if I don't recognize the number, and I never, ever step foot inside a store after the sun goes down. The static on the radio board was the only thing keeping me company until the phone line lit up with a dull, steady glow that signaled a caller was waiting in the darkness. "My name is Leo, and I run the Midnight Groove at a small, independent radio station tucked away in a basement unit of an old industrial building. Outside, a massive summer storm was tearing through the city, turning the streets into rivers and knocking out the streetlights one by one. I leaned into the heavy, foam-covered microphone and welcomed my listeners to the graveyard shift, my voice smooth and practiced despite the hollow feeling in my chest. I pressed the button to take the next caller, expecting a lonely soul looking to request a jazz track or vent about the rain. But when the line opened, there was nothing but a heavy, rhythmic silence that seemed to pulse in time with the flickering overhead lights. "You are on the air with Leo. What is on your mind tonight?" I asked, keeping my professional tone steady even as the silence stretched into 5 uncomfortable seconds. I could hear the faint, distant sound of wind howling, but it wasn't coming from outside my window. It was coming through the phone receiver. It sounded as if the caller was standing right in the middle of the storm, yet their breathing was perfectly clear, right against the microphone. I waited for a response, but the caller remained a ghost on the line, refusing to speak a single word before the connection abruptly cut to a dial tone. I shook it off as a bad connection or a prank, spinning a long blues track to give myself a moment to breathe and check the radar. The storm was worsening, and the basement walls seemed to groan under the pressure of the rising wind. 10 minutes later, the line lit up again, the same flickering red bulb demanding my attention in the dim studio light. I hesitated this time, my hand hovering over the console as a strange sense of unease settled deep in my stomach. I picked up, but I didn't introduce myself this time. I just listened to the void on the other end of the wire. Through the headset, I heard a very distinct, metallic clicking sound that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. It was the sound of a heavy door handle being turned back and forth, slowly and methodically. My heart skipped a beat because that specific, heavy clunk sounded exactly like the reinforced steel door at the top of the station's stairs. I looked at the security monitor on my left, but the screen was nothing but a mess of rolling black bars and electronic interference. "Who is this?" I whispered, my voice cracking as the professional facade finally began to crumble under the weight of the silence. The caller didn't answer, but the clicking sound stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy boots stepping onto a hard surface. The sound was echoing through the phone, a slow, deliberate thud-thud-thud that matched the rhythm of my own racing pulse. I realized with a jolt of pure electricity that the caller was inside the building, and they were using their phone to broadcast their approach to me. They wanted me to hear them coming before I could ever see them. I reached for the landline to call the police, but the moment I touched the keypad, the entire studio plunged into pitch-black darkness. The power was out, and the heavy silence of the basement was now absolute, broken only by the faint green glow of the battery-powered backup lights on my mixing board. I was trapped in a soundproof box, 3 floors below the street, with someone who knew exactly where I was sitting. I grabbed my heavy mag light from the drawer, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped it on the floor. I kept the headset on, the long cord trailing behind me like a tether, because I was too terrified to break the only connection I had to my stalker. I could still hear him through the earpiece, the sound of his breathing getting louder and more ragged as he descended the final flight of stairs. I crouched behind the massive equipment rack, the cold metal pressing against my back as I tried to make myself as small as possible. I heard the heavy basement door creak open, the rusted hinges screaming in the dark like a wounded animal. The caller was in the room now, and through my headset, I heard the sound of a wet, raspy chuckle that made my skin crawl. I watched a thin beam of light cut through the darkness of the studio, dancing across the gold records on the wall and the empty guest chairs. He was searching for me, moving slowly, savoring the hunt while the storm raged invisibly above us. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. The studio was too small, and there were only so many places a grown man could tuck himself away. I saw the beam of his flashlight move toward the mixing board, illuminating the headset I had just set down on the chair to free myself. He picked it up, and I heard his voice for the first time, not through the air, but through the small speakers of the headset resting just inches away from my hiding spot. "I know you are breathing back there, Leo. I can hear your heart through the floorboards." He was standing right on the other side of the equipment rack, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the floor. I realized my only hope was the heavy fire extinguisher mounted on the wall just a few feet to my right. If I could reach it, I might have a chance to stun him and get to the emergency exit that led to the service elevator. I lunged for the red canister, my fingers gripping the cold handle just as he rounded the corner of the rack with a heavy, blunt object raised in his hand. I didn't wait for him to swing. I squeezed the trigger, and a massive cloud of white chemical powder exploded into the small space. The attacker coughed and stumbled back, blinded by the thick, choking mist that filled the air. I didn't look back to see if he was down. I scrambled toward the service elevator, hitting the manual override lever with every ounce of strength I had left. The heavy metal gate slammed shut just as a hand reached through the bars, grasping at my shirt before the lift began its slow, agonizing crawl toward the surface. I emerged into the rain-soaked alleyway, screaming for help until a passing utility truck pulled over to see what was wrong. The police arrived 10 minutes later, but the basement was empty, the only evidence of the intruder being a damp cell phone left sitting on my broadcast chair. The screen was still active, showing a call that had been running for 45 minutes straight. I quit the radio business that very night, and now I work in a bright, crowded office where the only thing I have to listen to is the hum of the copier. I still have nightmares about that silence, and I never, ever answer a phone if I can't see the face of the person on the other end. The silence of a sleeping house is never truly silent, but that night, the stillness felt heavy, like the air right before a massive heart-stopping lightning strike. My name is Sarah, and I was alone in our new suburban home with my 6-month-old son, Toby, while my husband was away on a 3-day business trip. The neighborhood was one of those quiet, cookie-cutter developments where nothing ever happens, and the streetlights cast long, skeletal shadows across the nursery walls. I was exhausted, drifting in and out of a shallow sleep in the master bedroom, when the small plastic monitor on my nightstand crackled to life with a burst of white noise. I sat up instantly, my heart hammering against my ribs, expecting to hear the soft whimpering of a hungry baby. Instead, I heard a sound that made the blood in my veins turn to liquid ice. The sound of a phone ringing, muffled and distant, coming through the monitor speaker. I reached out and turned the volume dial to its maximum setting, pressing my ear to the plastic casing of the parent unit. The ringing stopped, and then I heard the unmistakable click of a phone being answered, followed by the heavy, wet rasp of someone breathing. The sound wasn't coming from my room. It was coming from inside Toby's nursery, which was just 20 feet down the hallway. I felt a surge of pure, primal adrenaline as I realized that someone was standing in my son's room, holding a phone right next to the high-definition baby monitor. They weren't calling me on my smartphone. They were using the monitor to broadcast their presence to me, turning my own safety device into a tool of psychological torture. I gripped the edge of the mattress, my knuckles turning white, as a low, distorted whisper came through the speaker. "He has your eyes, Sarah." The mention of my name sent a jolt of terror through me that almost made me sick, and I realized this wasn't a random intruder, but someone who had been watching us for a very long time. I slowly slid out of bed, my feet hitting the cold hardwood floor without making a sound, as I reached for the heavy glass lamp on my bedside table. I didn't have a weapon, and the nearest landline was in the kitchen downstairs, meaning I was cut off from the outside world. Through the monitor, I heard the sound of a rocking chair beginning to creak, the old wooden chair that sat right next to Toby's crib. Creak, creak, creak. The rhythm was slow and steady, a haunting lullaby played by a monster who knew I was listening to every single movement. I crept toward the bedroom door, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps that I tried to stifle with the palm of my hand. I looked down the dark hallway, where the door to the nursery stood slightly ajar, a sliver of pale blue light from the nightlight spilling out onto the carpet. The monitor in my hand continued to broadcast the sound of the rocking chair. But then, the sound changed. I heard the soft metallic jingle of a zipper, followed by the sound of someone sliding a heavy object across the floor. "Don't come any closer, Sarah," the voice whispered through the monitor, sounding unnervingly calm and predatory. "If you leave this room, the baby wakes up, and we wouldn't want that, would we?" I froze in the doorway, the hallway stretching out before me like a mile of open ground where I would be completely exposed. How did he know I was at the door? I looked up and saw a tiny, blinking red light in the corner of the ceiling, a small wireless pinhole camera that I had never noticed before. My house had been bugged, turned into a stage for this person's sick game, and every move I made was being watched on a screen somewhere. I realized that the silent caller wasn't just in the nursery. They had control over the entire environment. I retreated back into the bedroom, locking the door and sliding the heavy dresser in front of it, my mind racing for a way to save my son without getting us both killed. I remembered that my husband had left his old tablet in the nightstand drawer, and I fumbled for it in the dark, praying it had enough battery life to turn on. The screen glowed to life, and I quickly opened the home security app that was linked to the external cameras we had installed on the porch and backyard. I swiped through the feeds, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw a dark van parked 2 houses down, the engine idling and the lights turned off. Someone was sitting in that van, watching the feeds from the cameras inside my house, while another person was inside the nursery with my baby. This was a coordinated home invasion, a professional hit designed to trap me while they took what they wanted. The monitor crackled again, and this time, I heard the sound of Toby starting to stir, his small, soft grunts of discomfort cutting through the static. "He's waking up, Sarah," the voice said, and I could hear the smirk in his tone. "It's time for you to make a choice." I knew I couldn't wait for the police. The nearest station was 10 miles away, and by the time they arrived, the van would be gone. I grabbed the tablet and navigated to the smart home settings, finding the controls for the outdoor floodlights and the high-decibel fire alarm system we had integrated into the ceiling. If I couldn't get to Toby, I would have to make so much noise that the entire neighborhood would wake up and the intruders would be forced to flee. I counted to 3, my finger hovering over the panic button on the screen, and then I pressed it with everything I had. Instantly, the house was plunged into a chaotic nightmare of strobe lights and a piercing, 120 decibel siren that shook the very foundations of the building. The noise was physical, a wall of sound that made my ears ring and my head throb. Through the monitor, I heard a muffled curse and the sound of heavy footsteps sprinting out of the nursery and down the back stairs. I shoved the dresser aside, tore open the bedroom door, and ran into the nursery, scooping Toby out of his crib just as the back door slammed shut with a violent bang. I held my son against my chest, shielding his ears from the blaring alarm, and looked out the window just in time to see the dark van screech away from the curb, its tires smoking against the asphalt. The police arrived minutes later, alerted by the central monitoring system, but the house was empty. They found the pinhole cameras, the burner phone left on the rocking chair, and a set of zip ties laying on the floor next to the crib. The silent caller was gone, disappearing into the night as quickly as he had arrived, leaving behind a home that no longer felt like a sanctuary. We moved out the very next week, and now I never use a baby monitor that connects to the internet. Some silences are peaceful, but I know now that some silences are just waiting for the right moment to scream.